Now that I've finished penciling, I'm going to start inking. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to ink in the border and the letters. If you have a ruler and you're going to ink with it, one thing that I find really important is the cork back, because if you ink with a ruler directly on the paper without a cork back, the ink will get sucked underneath it and it'll ruin your borders. If you don't have one, you can put masking tape on one side just to raise it off of the paper a little bit. I first ink in the panel borders just to give me a nice framework, and then I work on the letters. And it dries pretty fast, but you don't want to work on everything at once, otherwise you can smudge your ink all over the place. I just take it one page at a time. Sometimes when I'm inking my letters, I don't use a nib. I use like a Micron or a felt tip pen. When you're inking in letters, it's nice to have something that you feel comfortable with, but I feel comfortable with a nib. If you don't, you can feel free to use a Micron. I'm running out of room, so I'm just going to put the S on the outside here, and I can fix that later in Photoshop. It's okay to make mistakes. You can fix things later, and if you have whiteout, you can use whiteout to fix things also. But don't feel bad about making mistakes. It's really about making mistakes and just kind of rolling with it. So before I move on to the next panel, I'm just making sure that my ink is dry. You don't want to have a bunch of wet ink on your page without knowing where it is. So I'm just taking a look, making sure that it's dry. It looks pretty good. I'm going to start inking the next one. When you have these two panels stacked on top, you can ink both of the sides at the same time by picking up your pen, skipping over the gutter, and picking the ruler up. So I'm going to keep inking in the borders and the letters, and when that's all dry, I'm going to start inking in the characters and setting. So I usually ink in the foreground first, just so I can let my hand be heavy. So then when I work on things in the distance, I can start feeling like a lighter hand. But I'm just gonna work on the outlines first, and I can add details later. And I let myself not stick with my pencils. Like if I wanna add textures to things, I can do that with my ink. But if you don't feel comfortable doing that, your pencils can be more detailed or tighter. But I do like a loose pencil just so I can make decisions as I'm working. I'm going to put some of the body of the squirrel in silhouette, but I'm going to fill that in later with a brush. So I can still make decisions later when I'm working with a brush. You'll see with things like this where the razor wire and the squirrels are overlapping, if there's two different objects and the lines collide, the object that's behind, sometimes I just don't let that line connect. So it almost has like a little bit of a halo effect, which causes there to be a little bit more perceived distance. So it just adds kind of an atmospheric perspective. So right now I'm just drawing the foreground in with a slightly thicker line. The cars in the distance with a much thinner line. It creates a sense of atmospheric perspective or a little bit of a 3D effect, as well as the halo that adds that kind of effect to really reinforce the overlap, especially when we're working on such a tiny scale. I got the fence in, and I'm gonna work on this squirrel that is in the foreground. So even though I didn't pencil some things, I can kind of picture it in my mind. So I didn't see the squirrels, but I can just sort of imagine where it is. Already it's getting slightly too complicated for me, so I'm gonna let some of the things up to the reader's imagination. I'm going to describe most of King with a brush because I want him to be almost always in silhouette because of the coloring of his breed. Articulate that in almost a silhouette, which will make him stand out in the comic. And I always like adding texture to things. If the ground is made out of mud or if the ground is made out of grass, try to articulate that and describe those things. If a setting doesn't have any sort of indicators of what it is, it's just nice sometimes to put, the dots on a wall to make it seem like there's plaster there, or just texture marks. And also having a texture that runs in back of this chain link fence really creates depth, just like the atmospheric perspective. Just having it travel behind the fence. Maybe even the chain link fence will add a little bit of a shadow on that squirrel to give it a little bit more depth. But again, I can describe some of these things when I'm using the brush. Even with a body like King has, you can even use atmospheric perspective a little bit in small spaces, even with his body. So this leg I might have with a slightly thinner line. It's almost imperceptible, but just having a slight line variation causes a lot of depth. So with this scene with King and his master, in the background, I'm going to draw the easy chair and the owner with a slightly thinner line. And the way that I'm doing that again is just pressing less hard. With the back of the chair, I decided that I'm going to do a little bit of cross-hatching here, just to kind of give it a little bit of dimension. When I'm working on something in the distance, I'm going to really try my best not to press almost at all. As I'm working on the foreground, I'm allowing myself to use the weight of my hand to make the line heavier. The shelf that King is stealing, I'm also going to kind of treat it with a slightly lighter hand. King will stand forward. We'll be able to see him easily. And then we won't get too caught up in the cheese balls. And if you don't know what something is, like back here behind the owner, I added a little shelf there, but I don't even know exactly what it is. Sometimes just adding something on a wall breaks up the space and it creates a perceived depth. So I'm just going to finish this next panel and then I'm going to go back and work with brush to add some more shadows to create more depth. I'm going to ink in with a brush because King is mostly black, so it's easier to ink in large spaces with a brush. Sometimes when you're doing something that's really slow and you're inking, you can see like a drip about to happen. So if something's about to drip, you can just go back to your inkwell and just rub on the side of the inkwell and it'll be good as new. Because I'm working at such a small scale, I already kind of messed up and I filled in his eyeballs. So when I go into Photoshop, I'm just gonna fix a couple of things. So I'm also allowing myself to mess up if it's on a small scale. Now you can see that the fence really kind of comes forward. I like how King is looking, but then when it comes to the squirrels and the razor wire, I'm gonna add some shadows in just to make it all kind of pop. A lot of people, when they're thinking about shadows, they get worried about not understanding light. As long as something is underneath something, you can add a shadow to it. So if something is under, like under a cufflink or under a hedge, you can ink something in like that because it makes the object kind of pop. So underneath some of these chain links, I'm going to add a little bit of a shadow. And some of these razor wires, I'm going to ink in completely black just to kind of make them have a three-dimensional quality. Even some of these shadows here, I'm going to make them a little bit darker on the squirrel in the foreground. But I'm going to keep going into the chain link. I like how it looks up here, so I'm going to keep adding shadows underneath where a perceived chain link would overlap. That gives the chain link a three-dimensional quality. And if you're doing something like that where it's a pattern or a perceived pattern, it's good to complete the pattern. It looks kind of odd over here, so you can see that there's a shadow that needs to happen over here. I'm gonna let myself go back to the nib for a second. I just want to add in some details behind King to make him stand forward again. I'm just kind of making some broken lines that run behind the squirrel and behind King, which in my head is like a roll gate on the door of the house where the man lives. And then there's a car back here that I'm just gonna add some windshield to. And here, this leg for the squirrel, I'm adding a little bit of a shadow because it's underneath, like the leg is coming forward, so there's a little bit of an area for a shadow there. So I'm gonna keep using my brush and inking in the large shapes of King, and then I'm gonna use my nib and my brush to ink in the rest of the comic. And again, remember, when you're using a brush, having it perpendicular to the paper and not sideways. If you work with a brush sideways, you're gonna get a lot of lines that you didn't intend. Really just try to get the tip of the brush to touch the paper. Right here, the top of this panel, I don't really like the way that it looks. It's just the way that I kind of crammed things together there. I will fix that in Photoshop too. But you can also, if things like that happen, you can use another piece of paper. You could tape your words onto another piece of paper if you want and just glue it right on top. Or you can use whiteout to change things, whatever you have available to you. So now I'm going to apply the same care and finesse to all of the rest of the panels. Now I'm finished inking. You can see that there are some mess ups. In the dream, I decided that having it in sort of a dream bubble would make more sense. And as I was inking it, I realized that I added numbers, but I don't think that they'll be able to get printed because it's so close to the edge of the paper. So in Photoshop, I'm also going to get rid of the numbers. I like how the cover turned out, the large amount of black that I used with the brush for King himself. I did mess up a little bit, but again, I can fix that in Photoshop. The shadows are pushing the ground down and the lower half of King back. I added a little bit of a dramatic shadow to the top of the word King, just to make it feel like it actually has weight, so it feels heavy. When I think about this dog, I kind of think about him as a heavy dog. I kind of like the way that the razor wire on the back of the word spirit looks. And it's less detailed, like the chain link fence behind the word. It's clear that it's chain link fence, but because of the quickness of the line, it still just reads as cross-hatching, so it feels atmospheric, but you can still understand what it is. I'm pretty happy with the way that turned out. In this last panel, so this is page 6, you can see that I added a lot of detail in the junkyard itself, but still it's quite simple. They're all really light lines. And it creates a lot of depth, especially with King lumbering forward with his wolf friends. Just having that atmospheric perspective there creates depth in such a small amount of space. Okay, so this is my final ink. I'm going to use this to reproduce my comics. You'll notice that I added a dotted line before I erased my pencils. It's important to keep that line because that's the line we're going to cut on when we make our final comics. In the next lesson, I'm going to show you how to make copies of your final book.